Yeah, we're going to have to approach this from a scientific basis. We've heard so many pronouncements: buy black campaigns, boycott Christmas holiday shopping campaigns. The overwhelming majority of them have produced no measurable impact. So in my new book, and I know you're familiar with my new book, The Repairing, I'm advocating we've really got to develop a brilliant habit of thinking outside the box. If it's been suggested 1, 2, 5, 10 times before and produced no outcome, then we're stuck in the box if we're suggesting the same techniques and tactics again. To summarize real quickly, and I do this very extensively in the new research work, my 5th book on Pan-African economics came out in December, is that currently the African-American population is spending $1.3 trillion a year as consumers. This confirmed by about 8 different measuring agencies and non-governmental organizations. Yet, if we look at the output of 854 million black-owned businesses, the output on average at less than $60,000 each comes to only about 182 to maybe 187 billion dollars of productivity. So in essence, Brother Elliott and Brother Richard, we are spending $7 while producing $1. Buy black campaigns, boycott campaigns will not work as long as that imbalance in what we spend to what we produce is in place. Our first goal is to let's double our GDP and industrial output. So we spend 7 while producing 2. Let's double it again. When we get to the point where we spend $7 while producing $9 or $11, then we will be gaining intergenerational transfer of wealth. Until we do that, we're stuck in this rut, and we better start thinking outside the box.
And with that said, and I appreciate you making that shift, because that's one thing that I see that we do is deal with the consumer output compared to the productive output. But doesn't that also get to, when you're talking about thinking outside the block, something I guess I push all the guests to give feedback on, in defining what is our natural resource that we can be able to produce, and that out of that, it increases just the value in order to be able to generate more wealth.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, what is the natural resource that we'll be tapping into? That's a very, very good question. We can look at and we can see there are many aspects of contemporary black domestic economy that we do very well in. Let's look at hip-hop. Hip-hop comes out of an artistic, cultural, musical expression, which we seem to be very good at innovating periodically. Yet, when we produce hip-hop, it's amazing. Hip-hop is invented, created by our people. It's now become a global $500 billion a year economy, for which we're being paid just a few pennies on the dollar for that, despite the fact that it comes out of our own innovation. You could look into culinary arts. Black food, even though some of it is extremely unhealthy, nonetheless it does have a place in the competition of culinary arts. Black fashion, black styles, black entertainment and music. Let alone let us consider that the 45.7 million people who are African American citizenry, along with 2 million diaspora immigrants living in amongst us, we are the best educated, the best experienced, the best resource global population of 1.5 billion African people on the planet, 1 out of every 5 people on the planet. So by thinking outside the box, stop looking in the mirror and expecting to see equality with European Americans. We talk about that in the book, how everybody freaking out that it would take us 228 years to match their wealth at the current level of development. Stop looking in the mirror and expecting him to look back at you. Look in the mirror and see that we are the best educated, the most experienced, and wealthiest of global population of 1.5 billion. So what are the natural resources? One of our greatest natural resources is an entire continent.
And I would agree. And with that, and this becomes so important as I look over the list that you develop in relationship to Obama or any president, but specifically Obama and the aspirations people had. because I would like to, and you laid out the outcomes of the most important natural resource that we don't control. And since Africans in the Americas have never taken control or when had to, and that's the population itself. If we control the population, and therefore we control the production line of those skill sets or those outcomes, then we would be controlling the production ability of those resources. So since we don't control the development of what goes into the minds of the children, that is that natural resource, the development or secure through law or whether law or development, the skill sets that those children or that population produce, you have to control it. Any natural resource you have to control. Since we don't control it, therefore we don't control the production food chain that population produces, as you said, whether it be arts, whether it be culture, whether it be even intellectual property. As a people, we haven't put the infrastructure to control the people so that we can be able to control the outcome of the people. So even though we produce the amount that you mentioned, we don't control, so people are actually, we don't have to say buy black. We don't have to say those slogans because we will be controlling the outcome, whether it be by psychological or behavior. So people will be doing that because they know that's the best thing to do for their own self-interest.
You're making excellent points, and you touched on a number of things. I'm not going to even go into all the points, otherwise we'll be here for several hours panning out what you just said. I'll just make a couple of points. One, if we look at Black History Month and a long list of African, American, or Black inventors and inventions, this is an impressive list. It really is. The problem is, if we go down the same list of over 100 inventions and ask which of the industries based upon this invention are controlled by Black-owned business and Black-owned leadership, the answer is sadly none. And some of these inventions are very contemporary, inventions in communication. Much of the things that we use today and don't even think about it, a Black hand, a Black creative mind had a major place in bringing it to us all. And then the second part about that is in the book, The Repairing, my latest book, we do talk about the 6 pillars of empire. And Black people have created 15 significant empires in world history. We don't have to be sad or disappointed about such a record. But the 6 pillars of empire require us to, 1, control our demographics, as you talked about, control our birth processes and the management of those people. And African Americans, just through abortion in the last 44 years, have destroyed 1/3 of what should be our current population. And those people would all have been the younger age population. Point number 2, the 6 pillars of empire, we've got to take natural resources and create finished products out of them. We are ourselves natural resources. Number 3, we have to create a self-serving economy with what we produce. Number 4, we have to produce surplus and trade that surplus to build wealth and expansion for the group. Number 5, we must educate our own young people to gain the system, manage the system, and expand this system which serves the group's self-interest. And number 6, we got to secure it all. And security means not only protected from destruction from without or from within, but security also means you must expand your land to accommodate your numbers of people. Unfortunately, today, the population of nearly 50 million Black people living in the United States owns only 1/6 of the land they owned 100 years ago.
Brother Keidi, you talked about and dealing with this wealth inequality, and you mentioned when Richard mentioned about us being producers, you brought it up in the beginning, and you said we have a whole continent, which I do agree. But when you mentioned about thinking outside of the box, developing those partnerships between us here in the diaspora and the continent itself is going to take innovative minds, and I'm talking about Black minds, to do it. But I don't think it's as difficult as some of our people think. As a man that has been to several African countries, in meetings with groups dealing in business. Talk about, in your opinion, how simple or how difficult would this be? Because, you know, you were on with us before, and there's several countries on there that are willing to start talking with interested African Americans that want to do business. And I'm not necessarily talking about on an individual basis. I'm talking about on a collective basis. Now, we would have to do that as a grassroots, because I don't think you're going to get much political help from some of our elected officials, because they don't seem to want to rock the boat. In order to develop those partnerships, you're going to have to rock the boat. I'm talking about the governmental boat here, because they don't want that type of partnership between Africans in the diaspora and Africans on the continent. But talk about how difficult or how simple it would be to start developing these business partnerships, in your opinion.
And I'm not convinced that the American government doesn't want better trade relations with the African continent. They used to be in the number one position, but China has not only overtaken that position, but they've reduced America's trade, which at its peak with the African continent was about $75 billion a year. They have reduced that now to $27 billion a year for U.S. trade, while China's trade with Africa is now approaching upwards of $300 billion a year. And China is getting a 5-to-1 return on investment in their African development projects. So
no, Brother Keidi, I'm not talking about United States not wanting to develop partnerships. I'm talking about the United States not wanting black folks in the diaspora to start developing partnerships.
Well, and then that was really the point that I was disagreeing with. I go to a number of these international trade conferences. I try to attend at least 2 to 4 of them every year, including on the African continent. And at every trade conference, we find U.S. government officials from State Department, from Commerce Department, from different trade port authorities, et cetera, all attempting to assist us to get a workable program in place, because in actuality, we would be an advantage for this nation to attempt to gain that position or some semblance of that position back. Again, I'm saying to our people, don't make any presumptions anymore. We've been presuming a lot of things that has got the hole that we're in deeper and deeper. But here, I'm going to break it down on this grassroots level, as you say, because that's really where the incentive is going to come from. When we get our act together on the grassroots level, with grassroots, non-governmental organizations, public partnerships, meaning government agencies, private partnerships, meaning the business community, colleges and universities, and black media, which we are serving our function today. We're doing our job, but we got to build that partnership to really make it work. Then we will create the incentive, and they will be following our lead. Least we should forget, the first ecological program in the United States was from the mind of a black man, George Washington Carver, and it saved Southern agriculture because he taught them crop rotation, nitrogen fixing, etc. I'm saying the same thing. Some of the great macro solutions that America really could use to restore itself are in the minds and the creative hearts and the abilities and the talents of African people in this country. They disrespect us so greatly that they've even taught us to disrespect ourselves at an even higher level. But I suggest things like in the book we talk about a city like Philadelphia, just as an example, a great city in world history, a great city. You know, 2 African presidents, Nnamdi Azikiwe as well as Kwame Nkrumah, went to Lincoln College there in Pennsylvania. So we cannot dismiss this role of this city and these people in the world history. But a city like Philadelphia could adopt an entire nation. I would suggest go for the biggest prize of law, the Democratic Republic of the Congo, which is changing very, very rapidly. They're building major infrastructure projects there. But if African people in a city like Philadelphia committed to a 5-year plan of technology transfer, bringing in students from the DRC to be educated there, and developing sister city partnerships, et cetera, sending our young people to do their last 2 years or 1 or 2 years of their college there in the DRC, and et cetera, investing in and getting a 5-to-1 return on those investments. Quite simply, the black people in Philadelphia within a 5-year period would be the richest black people in the world. Why won't they do that? Because the leadership we have currently in place just doesn't know. As bad as we think they are, as much as we think they're corrupt and sell out, and we call them all these names, I know for a fact they don't know. Why don't they know? They don't spend a lot of time reading.
Oh, wow. Oh, man.
It's that simple. They just don't know.
Yeah, I was saying, I know in Philadelphia they have a African Caribbean through a council person commission, they call it. But I think that the challenge still pushing that forward again to what you're as you're laying out. But I agree when we're talking about grassroots, we have to push that we have to at the grassroots level maybe save more, because trading with African the continent is trading with equals, and we have to develop the investment infrastructure at a grassroots level, not just at a governmental level, but people to people, because those are individuals who are controlling those productive resources, even if they're using the state in Africa. We are not controlling yet our own productive resources, no matter what the economy is scale. So I think that we have to build that. I mean, using, as you say, the communication mechanism that we have is instructing us that one of the tactical, if not strategic moves that everybody can do is start off just by saving those dollars, not spending them. And then by collectively pooling those dollars and investing in something, even if it is an African student, because it costs to educate a person, whether bringing one over or sending one to. But that's an investment that can be looked at, and developing that skill base in order to help continue to develop the infrastructure, the organizational infrastructure and create the alliances. What do you think of that?
Oh, I think you're on point. Now we have to ask the question, what type of a saving strategy will work best for us? I think that, just withholding our money from economy is only a partial measure. I don't even consider that to be half of what is necessary. But redirecting the money into different type of instruments. When I was a child, for Christmas, our parents, many of our parents, my father included, used to buy his son's savings bonds as Christmas presents. There was a perceived value of that savings bond. We saw the numbers on the front of it. Oh wow, look at this money I'm going to be getting, but I had to wait 4 years or 7 years to be able to get it. There was a value there, and we did value it. But the backing of that savings bond went into the federal coffers, allowing the United States to build bridges, to build highways, to build railroad and other infrastructure that would allow for industry to develop, that would allow the whole nation now to consolidate its long-term wealth so that those bonds would meet their full value. Well, what I suggest in the book, we need a similar instrument, and it's possible to do so. I call it the Reparations Bond. And the Reparations Bond would be like other municipal bonds, other type of bonds, equity bonds that are out here available. It would be a long-term, interest-bearing instrument. It would allow for infrastructure creation. If we look at the money, and the figures won't be out for about another 2 weeks for the 2016 holiday shopping season, but we can look at 2015 because those numbers are very current. Despite the fact that we had this sustained campaign, Justice or Else, Boycott Christmas, and all of that stuff, during the months of November and December, black people in America spent in excess of their normal yearly spending pattern, $49.7 billion. Had we just taken 5% of that and converted that through investment bonds, reparations bonds as I call them, and taken that money of about $2.5 billion and invested it, you know something? We could have bought a grocery store chain. We could have taken the four of the top 10 black-owned businesses that are automobile parts manufacturers and essentially doubled or tripled their employment and capacity, and we could have been shipping parts from our now expanded capacity of automobile parts manufacturers who are struggling to stay in business under the current economic situation, and they could have then been exporting their automobile parts to the 6 African countries that are now manufacturing automobiles for the fastest growing middle class and population demographic of any region on earth. These kind of solutions are doable. They're workable. All of the fundamentals of what I'm talking about are there in place. We just have to ask the question, why don't our leadership think of ideas like this?
Brother Keidi, number 8 on your list. 762 murders, 12 months, one American city. And they're talking about Chicago, but you can spin that off into any of these other cities. They might not have as many murders, but the problem is there. Talk about it from your perspective. I want to throw something into the mix and get your opinion on it, but go ahead and speak on that issue. Number 8 on your list.
Yeah, the same thing we had said earlier about the wealth inequality being linked to violent crime. It happens in Honduras. It happens in Africa, South America. It happens all around the world. And it happens in U.S. cities. So that's number 1. Number 2, Chicago's murders equaled the numbers of the 2 largest cities in America. The largest city, New York, Los Angeles, number 2, Chicago, number 3. If you add up all of the murders in New York and Los Angeles, Chicago was higher this past year. Number 3, Chicago is the political hometown of the outgoing Obama administration. And so the ultimate insult to an Obama administration is to see his political hometown become the outrageous murder capital of the nation. And point number 4 is we have to look at the link between El Chapo, the Guzman Mexican-based drug cartel, and their pipeline, which led directly to Chicago. Mm-hmm. And there have been even reports out by major investigative units, including former intelligence officials and DEA officials, that said that Guzman drug pipeline to Chicago was deliberate and was being allowed. We saw it before with the CIA cocaine scandal that was funneling money from drug sales in Southern California down to support the Contra anti-socialist armies that were fighting in Central America. Are we so surprised to see evidence that the same thing has been set up again? So what's it going to take to change this in Chicago? I've been trying to get an invitation to Chicago to meet with the communities and the leadership there. What's it going to take? We're going to have to build a functional 6-part partnership, and we're going to have to give them marching orders that are practicable.
Go ahead, Richard.
Yeah, I was going to shift to number 40 and ask you why, as you have here, why the Haitians are chanting down with Obama, which I thought was interesting.
You know, Haiti, this beautiful Haiti, as we call it, is actually the way they call their own nation. It's a beautiful nation of people with a beautiful history. I've known many Haitian people in my life, and they're some of the most wonderful people. In fact, the Haitians or Haitians who come to the United States, they send more money home to their country from their employment in this country in remittances than any other ethnic group in America, including Israeli citizens sending money to Israel. I'm not talking about the U.S. government sending money to Israel. I'm talking about citizens supporting their own native country. Mm-hmm. So the Haitians are a role model for us, as they've always been throughout their history, from the 1803, 1804 overthrow of the French colonial government there. But, you know, the West has been punishing Haiti ever since. They became the models for similar revolutions in Brazil, and the Seminole Wars and other conflicts in the Western Hemisphere. They raised the banner of the Haitian history as part of their motivation to stand up and do what history was demanding of them. And so there's no surprise that under previous administrations, Haiti was always being punished, and the same thing has occurred under the Obama administration. At least we should forget when the major earthquake happened a few years ago. The Red Cross, a major U.S. NGO, supposedly International Aid Association, raised all of these hundreds of millions of dollars for Haiti, but kept the majority of the money inside the United States. And a whole spectrum of scandals under the Obama administration have happened against Haiti. And also, just like the Clinton administration and Bush administration, Obama administration always interfered with the Haitian elections. As much as they would complain about the Russians allegedly interfering with the 2016 presidential election in the United States, the record is very, very clear. The United States always interferes in Haiti's elections. Always.
I remember, as you said, Clinton with was that heresy and the whole point of him having to lead out, and it was to leave in the dark of night in order to escape, with the U.S. Pushing for him to leave because they didn't want him to have that democratic position that he was taking amongst the Haitian people.
The reason I'm saying it's socially engineered, I want to read something to you, Brother Keidi, and I want your opinion on this dealing with violence. And you're still there with me, right, Brother Keidi?
We are here live and direct. And,
okay.
Loving the conversation.
I want to read this to you and get your Brother Richard's opinion on it. And it's dealing with Chicago because you see a lot of this stuff has been plastered across the TV about the violence in Chicago. But violence is not a new thing in Chicago. It's always been there. But let me read something to you and get your opinion on it because it kind of goes to my opinion that all of this is socially engineered. And this is from a published report that talks about the violence in Chicago. It says, in America, just as in many countries, outlaw heroes and larger-than-life historical figures have appeared and been looked to by the public in response to certain situations. These situations may include unjust or unpopular government regulations, concentrations of wealth in the hands of a few, or widespread poverty. All these situations existed in the United States during the early years before the Great Depression and preceding. And throughout the early years of the Depression years, the government banned alcohol in what became known as the Prohibition years from 1920 to 1933. Faced with economic hardship and depression and desperation, the American public needed heroes. Thirsty Americans especially needed someone to outsmart the government's ban on alcoholic beverages. Quick to respond to the call throughout the 1920s, ethnic gangs in ghettos across Chicago emerged, which were once groups that were loosely associated through criminal activity, became organized and had been delivering the goods, especially bootleg liquor. As a result, in the late 1920s, these criminals now operated well-constructed groups, generally referred to as organized crime, and were established and very wealthy. Powerful members of organized crime units or gangsters such as Al Capone of Chicago became public figures of mythical proportions. In addition, by 1933, outlaws in the Midwest began racing throughout the heartland, robbing banks, and to some citizens who had lost all of their savings in bank closures, these outlaws were often seen as contemporary Robin Hoods. On the other hand, to those that lost money in bank robberies, it was a cruel feature of the Great Depression. The presidential inauguration of Franklin Delano Roosevelt in March of 1933 saw the advent of the New Deal, Roosevelt's plan for relief, reform, and recovery. The government suddenly seemed responsive to the common man. These new government programs designed to raise employment, restart the economy, rekindled a spark of hope in America that the economic woes would come to an end. Due to this renewed faith in the government and new hope of the future, America began to view crime more negatively and felt as though this scourge of crime must end. So we see that especially in white communities, there were a have and a definite have-nots, which led to a lot of the organized crime in Chicago, in New York, and a lot of these major cities. I looked at the records. In 1929, the year of that St. Valentine's Day massacre, they had more murders in Chicago than they did last year in Chicago. So the government knows what causes a lot of this violence. So when Roosevelt came up with that New Deal, it was to stem the tide of violence all across the country in these in these cities, especially talking about white populations. And it was almost transferred over to black folks. Because when we had towns operating, we were self-sufficient. You didn't have scourge of violence in a lot of these towns. All we got to do is look at the historical record. You didn't see a lot of that. But you see the things have been socially engineered and reversed where these things are on the black community. Your opinion on that, Brother Keidi, and also Richard.
Well, you say it a lot. And again, it's very necessary for us to study these histories so that we see where we are and anticipate where we're going. So I'm going to just have a very quick response to what you just shared because, as you say, it was a couple of quick responses. One is you mentioned Rosewood and the Greenwood district of Tulsa, Oklahoma. According to my research, there were 4 black cities that I know of that were destroyed: Colfax, Louisiana, as well as Fort Clinton in Mississippi.
Okay.
But then we have a historical record over the period, over the same period from the end of enslavement, actually from 1820 until about 100 years later, of creating well over 100 black towns in this nation. So if we consider we created over 100, we know of 4 that were destroyed, and then again, the second part of that Tulsa story, most people don't tell the rest of the story about Tulsa, Oklahoma, Black Wall Street, because in 5 years they had rebuilt the whole thing. So it's not that they just destroy it. We can rebuild it as well.
Okay.
But listen, if there were a record of 100 and 4 were destroyed, that means if I create 25, chances are that 1 on average will be destroyed. That's incentive for me to keep creating. And we've somehow become self-regulating, such a fear of destruction that we don't even create anymore out of an anxiety that it will be destroyed. But 3 quick points I'll make based upon what you said, and I'd love to hear Richard's response as well. 1, crime will fill an economic void. That's always been true, and I think everything I heard you describe was crime filling in that economic void. Point number 2, young males need to be politically, socially, and economically engaged. One of the best ways to get rid of criminals is to give them a respectable, esteem-building engagement in the economy. In other words, a good, high-quality job. And point number 3, we have to ask this question. Ultimately, this is the only real question related to our future. How do we plan for? This is not the only, but this is one of the newest questions we got to deal with. How do we plan for a new global economy as the American empire is declining in that 6th stage of the evolution of civilizations that Carol Quigley wrote about in his book? The American empire is on the verge of severe collapse back to a domestic economy, economic engagement. Do we have any plans for dealing with that collapse? Unfortunately, I think that we've really kind of overlooked and neglected that and haven't focused enough attention on that.
And I think that, and I agree. I'm glad you brought that up, Elliot, because I was looking at just as you were reading it, I was going through and looking at, as Brother Keidi had mentioned, the historical, done the historical piece on economic development and raised, as you said, Brother Keidi, about how these towns, which goes back to your point about the bond issue, because I think that one thing about that period, and I just have 2 juxtaposing points, but one thing about that period, it was a lot of collectives that were going on. People were pooling their resources together. That's how they supported these businesses. Say in Philadelphia, 1903, they put a cemetery of cemeteries together. They didn't issue stock. They issued interest-bearing notes that people could buy, so they would take that money in order to purchase a cemetery, because early cemeteries, there was no place to bury African Americans. Well, there was places, but no large place. Plus, the older cemeteries that come out of the 1800s were being, in the city expansion, were being asked to be moved, and the internments were moved to Eden Cemetery. But the point was that all the way through, they were doing these collectives, and that ties to something that you said, Brother Keidi, about your bond, the way you constructed the bond, because they were basically bonds, because they were interest-bearing notes, but they were investing in businesses. So we can see how the development of communities, barbershops, banks, entertainment centers were developed out of these here collective investment units. History is good if we use history as a military, to be able to analyze from a military perspective, to analyze, and that goes to your point, Brother Keidi, again, because then we have to ask, they're pushing now that not only do the American empire is declining, but saying that the whole Western economic system is moving into a new phase, which they're calling the Fourth Industrial Revolution. And your question asks is where do we have plans for that? Where do Africans in the Americas or anywhere else fit in to this here new global order? I think we do have plans. This discussion and your book shows that we have plans, but how we're going about to implement it, taking this information and actualizing is what's being asked. And Elliot, as you laid out, it shows when we're not implementing these things, the outcome. And Brother Keidi in number 51, dealing with the whole question about the prisons, the outcome is how do you house people who you don't want to come up with out-of-the-box solutions for themselves. Well, the prison industrial complex was created. That's my reaction.
Wow. Brother Keidi, Richard mentioned 51. Did you want to talk about that one, Richard, or you want to?
I mean, I'd like to see how what I'm interested in is that since you put these together, Brother Keidi, I assumed that I know because you gave us the information of where we can go and follow up on our own on your 75 points. But what did you discover out of your research in relationship to that, to put that as an Obama mishap or misstep?
Yeah, Obama admits U.S. has the biggest prison population in the world. This is from the antimedia.org. And just to put that in context, I'm going to return to my book, The Repairing. And those who want to know what we're talking about, therepairing.com is where you can get the book and learn about the self-determining reparation strategies, which is the essential foundation of the entire book. But we have to look at this whole imprisonment in a different context than the nation looks at it, even though ours is directly related to the nation. Here's the thing. The U.S. has a total of about 2 million people in prison. As we said, count up the next 4 to 5 nations, add them all together, the United States is still higher than that. Nations like China, which is a population 4 times the size of the United States, still has far fewer of its people in prison. The cost of keeping a person in prison averages about $35,000 a year per person. Women are more expensive than men, older people more expensive than younger people, but about $35,000 annually in the U.S. incarceration system. The average worker in the United States in the economy produces about $70,000 worth of industrial output, products and or services. So therefore, it costs the nation to keep people in cages, but if they let them out of the cage, educated them, and put them in a firm place in the workforce, they would be producing $70,000 worth of GDP. In prison, that $35,000 does contribute to the services sector, which is 80% of the U.S. economy. But if they were not in prison, they would be producing twice as much of that. But if we look at the percentage of black people in prisons, almost just under 900,000 people, and we calculate what the impact of them being not in our productive workforce, but being in prison, that is costing us as black people about $70 billion annually. And that is a major blow to an economy where our consumption, which could be our GDP and consumption, I should say, could be equated to purchasing power parity. If we were to try and use that as a metric of our value, with this, then that $70 billion is a significant proportion, probably about 5 to 6% of what would be our purchasing power parity. But if we're looking at our industrial output at 182, then represents about 35% of what would be our GDP. 35% of what we produce, theoretically, is locked up in the prisons. We better figure that out, and better figure it out soon. Because if we look at what 35% hit on any national economy would be to any nation on earth, 35% hit would take them out, take them down. And we wonder why we're so non-functional.
Wow. Let's go to, let's take a call or two. 215 area code. What's your name? Where you calling from? 215. 215 area code. What's your name? Where you calling from? Let's try another one. 602 area code. What's your name? Where you calling from?
Yes, good brothers. This is Brother Marcus from Memphis.
How are you, Marcus?
How you doing, Brother Marcus?
Doing great, good brothers. I like to talk, you know. But I tell you where we go from here. We implement Mr. Garvey's program. Now is the time, because you see, really, you know, if black folks, if we were to implement Mr. Garvey's program now, we could take over the U.S. economy. If black people would unite economically with the Africans, as the brother was saying, the people, not the government, to pay the government the taxes, whatever. But we here in America, in the West, we have the technical ability and we have the capital. We have access, as the brother was talking about capital. They're just getting it together. We could use things like crowdfunding. You know, those are different financial tools. You know, and develop and do business with our African counterpart. And from them, they have the labor, they have the resources. We bring in the factories, we bring in the roads. You know, we're the ones should be benefiting from that fourth industrial revolution. Mm-hmm. We have to be a part of that. You know, so we have to factor in spite of what's going on here, we have to link with our mother. As Dr. Clark said, we have to tie that card back with our mother, that economic card, that cultural card back. You see, we have to do that, or else we cut off here. See, without that out, we cut off. And we see what people organizing and preparing now. We see what they're putting in place. You see, so, we have to say, look, it's time, we got to Garvey's program. That is a solution for us. That's the direction we should go. Go back to our mother. The lady was talking last week, and she was talking about us going back and going back. That's a part of our healing too. We got to go back to our mother and go heal and go cry, and get some time to regroup. Because they ain't going to regroup here. You see, you got to back then. That you can't regroup, because every time we make a move, you knock it out the box. So we got to say, look, all right, this is war. This is war we in. This ain't no joke. People dying. We see what's happening. We see what's going on, So Mr. Garvey's program should be seriously thought of right now. and see how we can implement that, Jamaica with Haiti, with Cuba, and making that connection with our people, because, this is a worldwide thing. So we got to take it to the world now. We got internet, we got all this stuff, WhatsApp, all this, so we got the communication. It's time. Garvey knows, Anyway, you good brothers, take care.
Brother Marcus,
take care, brother.
Thank you for your call.
All right, you're welcome.
Brother Keidi, any comment?
Oh, absolutely. Brother Marcus is right on point, and I've just made some notes. Much of my new book, The Repairing, as well as my 2000 book, The Road to Power, 7 Steps to an African Global Order, is based upon the foundation of Marcus Garvey's works, his vision, his articulation, and, of course, the record of the UNIA ACL. But just 5 quick points. He talked about the Garvey program. Number 1, Garvey highly emphasized global unity. He talked about 400 million of African people around the world supporting each other and coming to each other's defense. Well, now we are at 1.5 billion, 1 out of every 5 people on earth. Marcus Garvey demonstrated the power of black media through the printing press, the African World magazine or newspaper published. And well, now we have many new technological advances over media and communications, which can be utilized. This OTT media we're using, a voice over IP, and also I'm broadcasting on television channels as we speak. So IPTV, OTT, VoIP, we can bring all of these new technologies into play on the Garvey themes. He talked about capital formation. Earlier we were talking about a reparations bond and using these techniques of collective investment to acquire these major capital expenditures, etc. Marcus Garvey also gave us very specific instructions, and these I really take to heart. He says, teach your people science. And he said, to build for global sustainable development, we must be scientifically organized. I myself am one of a very small handful. I think there's only 3 of us that are published in the United States, black scientific futurists. Not a palm reader, not a bones reader, not to put any of that down because that's an expression of culture, and culture is very important for us as African people. But we use science, scientific disciplines and routine. And lastly, Marcus Garvey said, race first. Race first. When it comes to the Olympics and the relay races and the 100 and the 200, we all say race first. Well, let's do it on a global scale. 1.5 billion people need to be united under that banner, race first.
And it ties to, as Brother Marcus was saying, with this fourth, because they're saying this fourth industrial revolution is about, because it's about information, what you're saying about science and technology. It's about information and it's about data, even at the biological level.
You're describing really the third industrial revolution with data and technology, et cetera. The fourth now is introducing not only the biological integration of this technology, and that's really, we're going to be really, really careful about that, but also impact of robotics and artificial intelligence. Right. If we as black people on the planet are still struggling to consolidate the second industrial revolution, and now the fourth one has come along, we better get our act together, and we better do it very quickly. I like to point to the example of the East Asian nation of Singapore, which in 1962 had a GDP per capita of about $462 per person. 30 years later, they are about the wealthiest, or they achieved about the wealthiest per capita nation on earth, with a GDP per capita of over $80,000 per person. That is a nation which is about the size of the city of Chicago and had no natural resources. Singapore.
And they had that cultural identity, and they had the cultural infrastructure to put those policies in place. And we can, and I'm just reemphasizing your point, because we can do that if we acknowledge that, because it becomes a question of what some economists, political economists, call delinking, because it'll become important. What you had described as, you say with the robotics and information technology and, artificial intelligence, is the question about that with that age-old book that said, "Who needs the Negro?" Well, if we're looking, as you say, thinking outside of the box, that may not be a bad thing, because if we're not needed in the Western structure, that means that we need to create the cultural, the national infrastructure of our own, which we've been given examples of how they've been done in cities and towns of Black people doing those things. So it's possible, but as more and more of us get outside of the economic system, and you describe with the whole prison piece, it becomes more and more important why it's necessary for us to use the model that Mr. Garvey had and the Universal Negro Improvement Association and African Community League, what they had enunciated, because it becomes, again, using history to give that guidepost of what we can do in the future. And I like that I like that scientific futurism, and because it reminds me of the new cultural notion now about Afrofuturism that's being developed for us to be scientifically thinking but still maintain a cultural value as African people globally. So I think that's important when we're talking about developing political and economic infrastructure.
Absolutely. I love what I'm hearing, most definitely.
Brother Keidi, the number 21 on your list, Barack Obama and the gentrification of America. And you asked the question, the Manchurian Messiah. Go into that for me, Brother Keidi.
Yeah, and we have to ask the question, again, we understand how Black people, African Americans, have such a spiritual, psychological, emotional connection to this beautiful family that occupied the White House. We can understand that, but we still had to have effective leadership. And quite simply, for the self-interest of Black people, Barack Obama's presidency was not the type of effective leadership that advanced our position. One of the many things that happened during this period was the gentrification of American cities. We talk about the migration of Black populations from the rural South beginning about 100 years ago, right after the First World War, and then becoming such an important part of the northern economy, migrating to cities like Philadelphia, Detroit, Chicago, Gary, Indiana, Cleveland, Columbus, New York, and so many others, where we became part of an integral part of the labor force, especially when the country had to dig deep into the reserve labor force. And so when the United States labor force during World War II allows this country to advance as the economic superpower on the planet, it was to a large extent based upon the numbers of Black people as a labor reserve in these major cities. Well, look at us now, some 60 years after we had achieved population density to where we could afford or we could elect good governance in New York, or governance, let's say, in Philadelphia. I wouldn't necessarily say that Mayor Good was good governance, but we could elect governance in Gary, Indiana, Cleveland, Detroit, Chicago. But now that's reversed itself, and it could very well likely be we will never recover political dominance in those cities. Why? Because of the process of gentrification and the exporting of significant numbers of Black population into what are called Bantustan, these remote suburbs that are disconnected economically from the metropolitan areas that these populations are being shifted out of. Used to be Black people in these cities occupy the prime land within 10 minutes of the economic centers of some of the world's wealthiest cities, and now we're being shipped out and we're being replaced to a large extent by young, fresh out of college, young urban professionals, as well as immigrants who can come into these same neighborhoods, take some of these 400 closed Black schools that used to be serving us when we lived in these communities and remodeling them and creating new urban economic centers and facilities out of them. It's unbelievable. But what we call, from the loser's perspective, gentrification, the winners call urban revitalization.
Mm-hmm. And, we can track that, say, in Philadelphia from the 1930s, 1940s, where they actually, you could see the city plan, not the city planning, the business, the center city in Philadelphia, but also in Chicago and Detroit, as you said, they actually laid out that they were going to develop the center cities to be the hub and use the universities, develop the areas of the universities to be the other attractors and developers. So here in 1930s, they're laying out the whole basis of their future, which we're seeing manifest now. While at that point, as you said, because of the influx of Africans coming from the South into the cities, the question was about housing. And what they were calling slum was because the houses was such an deteriorated area. So where you had black people in these areas were prime areas, which unknown to us were going to be planned for us to be moved out of. They had already put in place ideals and strategies of how they were going to build up that third industrial revolution of information technology. They already had that in plan, which goes to your point. Well, what is it that we have in play 50 years from now? And what, even if it's the areas we're in or being moved to, what are we going to make them look like now? Who's doing that? And that gets to that point about I think you said responsible leadership?
Mm-hmm. Responsive. Yeah. Hey, just make him not comatose. It's not comatose. But here's the thing, and I'm glad you mentioned about the role of these major urban universities in developing the real estate and the economy, the sustainable economy of these cities. And when we think about it, we can go to Johns Hopkins University, the largest employer in Baltimore. We can look at other universities. Temple University right there.
University of Pennsylvania is the largest employer in Philadelphia.
That's right. We can look at the same thing happening at UCLA and USC, where these major non-black universities, they're inclusive, and most of their students on the West Coast are Asian, are developing significantly the future of the urban economy. Who's moving into the new housing projects being developed by these universities? It is their students developing their professional careers moving in, and so they know they're going to hold on to these geographies for the next 40 years when young urban professionals begin their career by moving into these areas. Let me ask you this question. I hope there's a positive answer. I don't know that there is one. Name one of the current 103 historical black colleges and universities that has taken a major role in building up the economic matrix of the city in which they're located.
Wow. Brother, we can't. I can't. Maybe Ellie can't.
No.
But you know what? That thing when you raise that question, the reason why I'm laughing, because when Du Bois tried to take that to the University of Atlanta, to do that, they kicked him out. He said, "Why shouldn't we should do a study? Using his sociological, scientific approach, and analyze the area where black people are in Georgia, and from an economic development plate." And he wanted the university to support it. They said no.
And Atlanta probably has come as close to this. We do know there is a record of Tuskegee University, but Macon, Alabama, was a rural county, and so Tuskegee is still essentially a very rural city, even though they did a lot to build up the local economics under the tutelage of Booker T. Washington and George Washington Carver. But Atlanta came actually pretty close to it, because the Atlanta University Center comprised of Morehouse, Spelman, Clark, Atlanta, and the other one that's almost closed now. I can't even think of their name. I used to actually even do some workshops and lectures there to some of the classes. But Atlanta's AUC now is in a ghetto. So they have not fulfilled their mission. They probably came as close to it under the brilliant leadership of Mayor Maynard Jackson. It's been a while since Maynard Jackson has been there, and the leadership since Maynard Jackson really has not fulfilled that promise or built upon his visionary shoulder.
Which goes to that point about the political infrastructure, that the black political infrastructure that surrounded itself around Obama. Because when you do when you look at the assessment that to pull together as far as the 70, I don't see where the policies that were and the lobbying by the ones who were around him were touching any of those things, if they were, other than maybe their own gainful employment. But I don't see that.
Well, we better figure this out. We have figured it out. We do have plans. My book, I'm proud to say, it's a tour de force. I've written 30 books, published 30 books, and this is the best one ever, the most comprehensive, the largest book I've ever published. My problem is how do I convince black intellectuals to buy the book, read the book? I know Brother Booker Elliott, you know what I'm talking about, is you not only got the print version, but you got the digital version as well. But, that's the big problem that we have, is getting our people to actually get these books, read the books, organize themselves. I would love to be on any college campus in this university. If I were a non-black academic and intellectual, I would be on a college campus. I'd mentioned that there's only 3 black scientific futurists that I know of in this country. And again, we're published, so we can find each other. The only other one above me, because the third one is my protege, the only other one above me is Dr. Calestis Juma. And he's been given a whole institute at Harvard University. Meanwhile, I'm over here in the middle of the desert struggling to pay the rent every month.